Good morning, everyone. It's very early if you're in Alberta. I guess it's afternoon if you're in the UK, where my friend Ben Rogers is joining us from. So we are in the middle of the something called the Global Week of Prayer for China, a period in time where the Christian community in particular works to highlight the situation in China and pray for the church as well as people facing persecution in China. And we hear a lot about kind of the impact on all different communities of the tightening repression under Xi Jinping, the impact on Uyghur Muslims, Falun Gong practitioners, Buddhists, Christians, and really just everyday people that are looking for or that want to go about normal life and not be tracked and monitored and punished for every little misstep. So great to have Ben Rogers on for a little Facebook Live this morning to help shed some light on the situation in China. He is a longtime human rights activist, worked on many different issues around the world. We worked together on Burma and on just various human rights things. It's early in the morning, as I said, here in Alberta. So Ben is also the founder of Hong Kong Watch. So Ben, great to have you on, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to join you, and particularly so this week.
I know we've got a little bit of a narrower frame, so we don't see the Winnie the Pooh in the background that you normally have. Yes, that's a key feature here. Well, maybe we'll come back to the significance of Winnie the Pooh and Chinese human rights advocacy. But first, Global Week of Prayer. What's top of mind in terms of the Christian community in China? What they are experiencing right now? The kind of escalation or tightening of persecution under the current Xi Jinping regime.
Well, Christians in China, of course, have always been persecuted ever since the Chinese Communist Party took power in 1949. But the persecution has sort of taken various forms, and there were periods in the 90s and early 2000s where it was a little less intense. It was more variable across the country, depending on the attitudes of regional leadership. But since Xi Jinping came to power, and particularly in the last few years, it's really intensified. I would say it's the worst persecution since the Cultural Revolution. We've seen in recent years the destruction of thousands of crosses, of even churches being closed, or in some cases actually destroyed. Churches are increasingly under pressure to display Chinese Communist Party propaganda, images of Xi Jinping. There's even an attempt or the intention of the regime to do a new translation of the Bible, which is believed to be turning it into a sort of Communist Party interpretation of the Bible. We wait to see what that will involve in detail, but it's very concerning. And basically just intense pressure on Christians of all traditions, and both those who are unregistered and those who are in the government-registered, government-approved churches, but who are increasingly forced to take part in Communist Party propaganda initiatives.
Mm-hmm. I have a weekly podcast for those who don't follow it already. It's called Resuming Debate, and we did an interview this week with Bob Fu, who's a pastor originally from China, was one of the Tiananmen Square protesters. Help us understand a bit more this emerging dynamic that Bob spoke about on the podcast, and that you kind of alluded to, of it's not kind of simple, direct banning of religion, but it is in a way the effort to eradicate its distinctiveness through totally co-opting it. That on the face of it, yes, it's fine to be a Christian, but underneath it, basically you're not allowed to have anything different in the context of what the church is teaching and saying than would come straight out of sort of Marxist propaganda. It's kind of a new and I mean, I don't know if this is the right word, but more subtle and sophisticated mechanism of persecution, but it's very insidious, and it's profound and unmistakable in the context of the church.
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, they call it, Xi Jinping and the Communist Party calls it a sinicization program, but that's a misleading term, because if it was simply about making faith kind of culturally, putting it in the cultural context of Chinese culture, I don't think there'd be much problem with that. But it's not about that. It's about putting it into a Marxist-Leninist framework and completely distorting the true teachings of Christianity, and the same applies to other religions as well. Yeah, it's basically about co-opting, as you said earlier, co-opting religion to the Communist Party's agenda and propaganda.
Yeah, and I think you make a very good distinction between sort of the sinicization that is making it culturally Chinese, and the communization of these things. But this is part of the rhetoric of the Chinese Communist Party. They want to associate communism inextricably with Chinese culture. And it's not just religion. They talk about democracy with Chinese characteristics. Well, Taiwan has democracy with Chinese characteristics, as it's a Chinese-speaking, culturally Chinese democracy. What the mainland has, unfortunately, is not democracy with Chinese characteristics. It is simple Marxist-Leninist, European origin communism.
Yes, that's exactly right. And of course, they will repeatedly make the charge against people like you and me, who are critics of the Chinese Communist Party regime, that because of our criticism, we are anti-China. They'll even take it to an extreme and suggest that we're somehow racist by criticizing the Communist Party. And I mean, the reality is nothing could be further from the truth. Speaking for myself, I love China. I first went to China when I was 18. I've got many Chinese friends. It's because I'm pro-China, the country and the people, that I speak out for their human rights. So I think it's really important to repeatedly make that distinction, that we're pro-China, we're anti the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, and I guess, is this part of the framing of the Global Week of Prayer to say prayer for China? It's really a positive event, right? I mean, it's a time when people in the Christian community are highlighting human rights issues in the context of China as well. But it's about positive hopes for China, not about condemnation of a people or a culture.
Yes, that's exactly right. It's very much prayer for China, for the church in China, but also for the other peoples of China, whatever their beliefs, and for them to have a better future, to have a future where they're free to live to their fullest potential, to express and practice their beliefs, and to be free of the repression and torture that exists today.
Mm-hmm. Could you speak a bit to the situation in Hong Kong in particular? You found that Hong Kong Watch, and ironically, perhaps this week of prayer aligns with the high profile trial of Cardinal Zen, probably the globally and probably in China as well, the best known Christian figure or Christian leader in China and from China.
Yes, absolutely. So he was arrested on the 11th of May, just a week or so before the week of prayer started. He's long been a target of Beijing because he's been so outspoken, courageously outspoken. And he was arrested as one of a number of trustees of a charitable foundation in Hong Kong that had been providing legal aid to protesters who'd taken part in the demonstrations in 2019, faced prosecution, and in order to support their basic right to legal defense, this foundation was helping them with their legal fees. And the foundation was wound up last year because it was regarded as being in violation of the draconian national security law. And now the trustees of it, including Cardinal Zen, had been arrested, and in fact he faced his first day in court, not actually the start of his trial, but
Okay.
appearing in court to hear the charges and prepare for the trial on the day in the week of prayer, the day that for several years has been the global day of prayer for China, started by Pope Benedict. And so I think that was an interesting, I don't think it was coincidence, but it was a very appropriate occasion that that day when we're focusing on China, he appeared in court.
Mm-hmm. So I had the honor of meeting Cardinal Zen a few years ago, and you had actually helped to facilitate that. So thank you again. You know Cardinal Zen personally. Maybe just give people a bit of a sense of his life, his work, and kind of the role he has played as a faith leader, but also a human rights and democracy leader, working closely with people inside and outside the church on shared areas of promoting and protecting human dignity.
Yeah, absolutely. So Cardinal Zen, who is 90 now, was born in Shanghai in mainland China, and then came to Hong Kong when he was quite young. I forget exactly what age, but and then lived in Hong Kong for the rest of his life. For a period of time after he's a Salesian priest. For a period of time, he was able to go back into mainland China and work with the Catholic Church in China, and even was teaching in a seminary. And I believe he at one point was actually teaching both underground Catholics, but also engaging in trying to help those who are in the state-approved Catholic Church. But he's always been a very vocal critic of Beijing, and more recently, of course, a leading critic of the agreement that the Vatican made with Beijing. In Hong Kong itself, he's also been one of the leading voices for democracy and human rights, and worked very much with, as you say, not only within the church, but with some of the most prominent pro-democracy leaders. He's a very close friend of Martin Lee, the father figure of the democracy movement, and of course of Jimmy Lai, the entrepreneur and founder of the Apple Daily newspaper, who's a devout Catholic himself and who's now in prison and may very well be in prison for the rest of his life. I first met Cardinal Zen when I lived in Hong Kong during the first 5 years after the handover from 1997 to 2002. At that time, he wasn't cardinal. He was the coadjutor bishop, so the sort of number 2 bishop. And then he went on to become the bishop and cardinal, and now he's the bishop emeritus. But he's a wonderful man. He's both courageous and strong, and I mean, I wouldn't want to be on the other side of the argument with him, because he holds his beliefs very fiercely. But at the same time, he's also a very humble and pastoral person. I mean, he spent much of the last couple of years going, I think, almost every day to prisons in Hong Kong to visit prisoners, to say mass for them, to pray with them, and just to visit them. And, you know, as I say, he's turned 90 now, but he's still going strong, and he's a real hero, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my own grandmother was a Holocaust survivor, and a big part of her story was Clemens von Galen, who was this bold kind of anti-Nazi bishop who was living in the Munster area of Germany during the war, and his criticisms of the Nazis kind of created the conditions in which she could survive. And so I've got a big portrait of him on the wall. People who follow me will have seen this before, and I think of Cardinal Zen as kind of a modern day Clemens von Galen, but he's his strength is expressed in a different way. Von Galen was a very kind of tall, imposing man who would kind of make whose presence would be known and noticed, and Cardinal Zen is kind of a short, intense, but with the same level of boldness, and the irony is, a 90-year-old guy who the Chinese Communist Party says is a threat to national security. It's just the the rampant abuse of this concept of national security is clearly on display. I mean, this is the outworking, isn't it, of what was expected when the national security law was passed, which was its use against anyone and everyone who has a contrary point of view.
That's exactly right. At the time when they introduced or imposed the national security law, they tried to say that it will only affect a small number of people and it won't be used retrospectively, and there's nothing to worry about. And all our concerns that we knew at the time that these promises were nonsense. We've absolutely been proven right. The number of people who've been arrested, the number of people who've been denied bail, the number of people who've been charged with under the national security law for activities that predated the existence of the national security law, and even the national security law has an extraterritoriality clause. And whilst nothing that I've experienced at all compares with what people in Hong Kong, people like Cardinal Zen, are going through, I've had a very small taste of it myself, in that I was 2 months ago threatened by the Hong Kong police force and the National Security Bureau, who claimed that Hong Kong Watch and myself personally were threats to China's national security and were in breach of the national security law. So it's a incredibly draconian but also absurd law. The idea that an organization, an individual based in London, totally registered in London with no entity in Hong Kong, could be within the reach of Hong Kong's law is crazy.
Yeah. Your story is quite bizarre on that front. It's essentially, maybe just you can share the full background of it. Getting a letter from the Hong Kong police, just like, you live in London, you're a British citizen, and you're speaking about foreign policy issue, doing advocacy primarily to the British government and through Hong Kong Watch to other Western governments. It's unfathomable, right? I mean, that in most normal terms, and so maybe share a bit of that story, and then of the political response on the UK side to a British national getting a letter like that saying you're breaking our speech laws, even though you don't even live here.
Yes, well, exactly. Well, and it's worth just saying that some further background to this is that way back in 2017, so long before the national security law, I was denied entry to Hong Kong on the orders of Beijing. So I haven't been able to go to Hong Kong since October 2017. But what this letter said, and the letter followed about a month previously, Hong Kong Watch's website was blocked in Hong Kong, and we learned that from various contacts. And then this letter came, and it basically said that we had to take down our website within 72 hours of receiving the letter, and that failure to comply could result in me personally, as the co-founder of Hong Kong Watch, being liable for a fine of 100,000 Hong Kong dollars, which is around, I think, around about 10,000 US dollars, and a prison sentence of, there were actually two letters. The first letter said between 1 year and 3 years, and the second letter said between 3 years and life imprisonment. So that's quite a broad spectrum. Now, obviously, there's nothing they can really do to enforce that, as long as I don't transit through Hong Kong. Although I probably have to be mindful of traveling to countries that have extradition agreements with Hong Kong, and I'll just have to take advice on a case-by-case basis in that regard. In terms of the political response, though, it was tremendous. We talked to the British Foreign Office straight away. We also prepared to release it to the press, and the BBC and the Times of London both broke the story, and then other media followed. But the British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss put out a very strong statement as the story broke, very much in support of us, condemning this action, and then other politicians and organizations followed. I was really very grateful to see one of your senators in the Canadian Senate, Senator Leo Housakos, raised it on the floor of the Canadian Senate. Actually, the Canadian High Commission in London also invited me to a briefing, and they invited several other embassies in London to that. So yeah, a lot of support, and in a way, I think it was actually very counterproductive for the Hong Kong and Beijing authorities, because it just shone another light on their appalling repressive behavior.
Yeah, we do have a case in Canada of a Canadian national, Hussein Chalil, involved in Uyghur human rights advocacy, who was taken from a third country, so who was traveling in Uzbekistan. So these kinds of threats can have a significant impact in terms of, I mean, obviously, if someone is taken, but also in constraining people's ability to travel. And this is just demonstrates the way that the government of China is trying to extend its reach beyond its borders. Let's kind of wrap up the conversation by just going back to the question of the church. What can people in Canada and the UK and in other places outside of China really do to support Christians and other minorities who are facing persecution? You and I are both Christians. We believe that prayer matters, but I know there's going to be some folks out there that are either more skeptical of that or just saying, in addition, what can we do concretely to advocate for and make a difference to support religious freedom and all of those who are suffering as a result of CCP oppression?
Absolutely. Well, I certainly believe that prayer matters, but I believe prayer is most effective when it's combined with action. So for those people who believe in prayer, definitely pray, but don't leave it at that. Consider action as well. And for those people who aren't people of faith, who don't believe in prayer, there's plenty that you can do too. And I would say the action for all of us, wherever we're coming from, is basically to keep these issues in the spotlight, and particularly with people like yourself. We should be raising these these issues with our elected representatives, whether it's in Canada, the UK, the US, or elsewhere, making sure that in our legislatures, questions are raised regularly, debates are held regularly, legislation, where possible and relevant, is initiated. And that our governments are held to account for how they deal with the challenge of the Chinese Communist Party's repression and persecution at home, but also its increasing aggression beyond its borders. So I would say, write to your elected representatives, ask them where they stand, ask them what they're doing. There are lots of NGOs around that can provide more detail as to policy initiatives that you can press your representatives on, but hold your representatives to account for what they're doing to support the people of China.
Mm-hmm. Okay, excellent. Well, getting people to lobby me and other elected officials is critical, and it does make a difference. And getting these things on the agenda, there are concrete things legislators can do, raising issues and passing legislation. And so, Ben, thank you so much for taking the time this morning. Well, I guess this afternoon in your case. And thank you, folks, for tuning in. If you want more content on this, folks can check out my podcast, Resuming Debate, on all the podcast platforms. Great conversation we had with Bob Fu, and just digging into some other issues. And maybe we'll try to share some articles in the comments as well. We didn't get to talking so much about the Vatican deal, I think, is an important aspect of it. And Ben, you've written extensively about that as well. So maybe we'll work to get you're one of the most prolific writers I know of as well when it comes to human rights issues. You're always churning out op-eds, so we'll get some of those into the comments. And thanks again for joining us, but more importantly, for all the work you do. And wish you very well in your continuing advocacy.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for all you do as well. Great to be with you.